This is a map of the 2020 House election results in North Carolina. There are a couple issues that this map reveals that reveal greater problems with the American political system more broadly. First of all, you'll notice that of the 13 congressional districts, Republicans won 8. You might gather then that North Carolina was a blowout for Republicans. However, you might be surprised to find out that Democrats actually won the popular vote in the state's House elections. That year, Democrats won 49.96% of the vote to Republicans' 49.41%. Because these districts were winner-take-all, though, Republicans were able to edge out victories and win over 60% of the seats, despite not even receiving half of all votes statewide. While some may point out that this district right here, District 12, actually didn't have a Republican running, which inflates the numbers a bit, Republicans still would only have 52% of the vote, not 60%. Republicans were also aided by gerrymandering, which is the second problem that this map reveals. North Carolina is famously one of the country's most gerrymandered states, with the state actually being forced by the courts to redistrict ahead of the 2020 election, because the previous map was so clearly drawn to benefit the Republican Party. You may notice that districts are carved out around the state's cities to ensure that Democrats can win only in those districts, while carving out large swaths of rural territory to make it easier for Republicans to win more districts, allowing them to carry the state. The final problem that this map shows us is a complete lack of third-party representation. Like much of the rest of the country, you will notice that not in any of these districts did an independent or third-party candidate win. Not one. This is, of course, because in each of these winner-take-all districts, only the two major parties are able to compete. Thus, despite the fact that voters who are registered to third parties or registered as independents actually outnumber Republicans and are only barely beaten out by Democrats in the state, Republicans and Democrats win every single race. So how do we fix this? How do we make Congress more representative of the people that it's supposed to represent? How do we get rid of gerrymandering? And how do we ensure that voters can vote for third parties and independent candidates without throwing away their vote? Proportional representation holds the answers to all of these questions. So what is proportional representation? Let's take a look at the 2020 election again, but let's apply it to the whole country. Once again, when you zoom out on the whole country, you see the same problems that we saw in North Carolina. Overrepresentation of the big two parties and underrepresentation, or rather lack of representation, of third parties. And of course, ever-present gerrymandering. So let's try something different. First of all, we're going to get rid of the districts. Then we're going to have voters vote for whichever party that they like overall, rather than voting for a specific candidate to represent their district. Next, we'll tally up the votes. So we get 50.8% for Democrats, 47.7% for Republicans, 0.7% for Libertarians, and 0.8% for other parties. So let's see what happens in this scenario. Instead of candidates receiving seats for winning districts, they win seats for the amount of vote that they get. So in this hypothetical proportional representation version of 2020, instead of winning 222 seats, Democrats would have won 50.8% of the 435 seats in Congress, or 221. So the difference there isn't anything extraordinary, but hold on, because the implications of this type of system are going to become more and more apparent. For instance, Republicans would win 47.7% of all seats, or 207 seats instead of 213. Meanwhile, the Libertarians would be able to win themselves 3 seats because they captured 0.7% of the vote. The other 4 seats remaining could go towards other third parties. This system fixes all of the problems that we've identified. First of all, by getting rid of districts and simply distributing seats based on percentages, we get rid of gerrymandering and make elections more proportional to the will of the people. It also helps third parties win bigger victories, as we saw in our example with third parties winning 7 seats as opposed to 0. It's likely that in the real world, though, third parties would benefit even more from proportional representation than in this example. That's because in order to win a seat in Congress, small parties no longer need to win a plurality of votes in an entire district. They simply need to get at least 0.23% of the votes. Thus, voters would be more willing to vote for smaller parties, as even parties with a small percentage of the vote would still be able to be represented in the government. It's for this reason that we see countries like Germany, Chile, and Costa Rica, which have some form of proportional representation, having far more parties represented in their legislatures than the United States, which just has 2. Not only does proportional representation fix all of the problems that we've talked about previously, it just generally makes our democracy better by ensuring that our legislature is more representative of the diversity of political opinions in our country. The result will be a government which more readily responds to the need of its people. The 2 large parties will no longer simply need to establish themselves as the lesser of 2 evils to voters in gerrymandered districts. They will have to appeal to voters who now have the freedom to vote for third parties without worrying about wasting their vote. And similar to other systems which have proportional representations, oftentimes the winning party will need to make compromises to the smaller third parties in order to form a majority in the government. This means that the Democratic Party likely wouldn't be able to form a majority without making concessions and gaining the support of socialist or green parties. And Republicans wouldn't be able to form a majority in the government without getting support from the libertarian or constitutionalist parties. And who knows, maybe this system would give voters the confidence to vote for third parties, finally breaking the duopoly in this country. Maybe one day, the United States will adopt this system and create a more representative democracy which actually listens to all of its people. But until that day, this has been Manzana Alert.